Neil adjusted his baseball cap, pulling it low over his brow as he approached the secluded park. The early evening sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the grass. He scanned the park nervously, the tension knotting in his stomach as he spotted Radley sitting on a worn bench under a large oak tree. His mother looked up as she saw him approach, a soft but cautious smile playing on her lips. Neil's footsteps slowed for a moment as memories of their past before his father had left flooded his mind. Those times were simpler without the constant feeling of shame that seemed to follow him now. As he reached the bench, Neil hesitated. "Is this really necessary?" he muttered, glancing around to make sure no one had followed him. The last thing he wanted was to be caught in this secret rendezvous, hiding in the park like fugitives. Yet here he was lured by the hope that this meeting might finally bridge the widening gap between him and Radley. Radley patted the spot beside her. "Neil, sometimes you have to break the rules a little to get things back on track." Her voice was gentle, but there was an undeniable strength behind it. This wasn't the first time she had tried to reassure him, but the years of strain between them hung in the air like a storm cloud. Neil sat down, the silence between them heavy, uncomfortable. He glanced at his mother out of the corner of his eye. She looked tired in a way that went beyond the usual exhaustion of a single mother working 2 jobs. It was the kind of tired that came from years of carrying unspoken pain. Neil cleared his throat, trying to find the right words. "You know, we shouldn't have to do this, sneaking around like we're doing something wrong." Radley sighed, leaning back on the bench and looking up at the sky as the leaves above rustled in the wind. "I know, Neil, but after everything, it just feels safer this way." For now she turned her gaze to him, her eyes softening. "I miss you. I miss us, the way we used to be, don't you?" Neil swallowed hard, memories of family dinners, holiday mornings, and late-night talks surfacing all at once. Of course he missed those times, but ever since his father had walked out on them, leaving Radley to shoulder everything on her own, things had been different. They had become different. He wasn't even sure how to find his way back to those moments anymore. "It's not that simple," Mom, Neil said quietly, picking at the fraying edge of his jacket sleeve. Things have changed. We've changed." Radley nodded slowly, her face a mixture of sadness and determination. "Maybe. But that doesn't mean we can't find a new way to connect. I'm not saying we'll ever go back to what we had before, but..." She paused, searching for the right words. "But we don't have to keep hiding. I want us to have a relationship, one that isn't filled with all this secrecy and fear of judgment." Neil felt a lump form in his throat, his chest tightening. The secrecy, the fear of judgment, it had been his constant companion ever since his father left. People always had opinions, always whispered behind their backs. A single mother and her teenage son, everyone had their own version of what had happened, why the family fell apart. He had learned to keep his head down, avoid the questions, avoid the looks. Radley's hand found his, squeezing gently. "Neil, sometimes you have to risk being seen. You can't live your whole life worrying about what other people might think." Neil's heart pounded as he looked at her, his mind wrestling with everything she was saying. There was a part of him that wanted to believe her, that wanted to throw off the weight of other people's expectations and just be. But could it really be that simple? He pulled his hand away, crossing his arms over his chest defensively. "I just don't get it. Why now? Why can't we just keep things like they are?" Radley's expression softened, a small, sad smile tugging at her lips. "Because, Neil, I can't stand the thought of losing you too. Your father. He left and I've been fighting ever since to make sure you and I stay close. But I'm scared. Scared that if we keep pretending everything is fine when it's not, that one day, I'll lose you too. And I can't let that happen." Her words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable, cutting through Neil's defenses like a blade. He hadn't expected her to be so open, so honest. For a moment he was speechless, staring down at his feet, feeling the weight of his mother's fears and his own discomfort in equal measure. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want that either, Mom." Radley smiled softly, reaching out to touch his cheek. "Then we can fix this. Together. It won't be easy, but we can try. And we don't have to hide anymore." Neil nodded, feeling a strange mixture of relief and fear settle in his chest. He wasn't sure how they would navigate this new chapter of their relationship, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like there was hope. A tentative, fragile hope, but hope nonetheless. As they sat in the quiet of the park, the tension between them slowly began to ease. They talked about the old days, about the times before everything fell apart, and for a while they allowed themselves to forget about the world outside. It was just them, mother and son, trying to piece together what had been broken. But as the sun dipped lower, casting the park in soft twilight, Neil knew that their conversation wasn't over. There were still questions left unanswered, still fears lingering in the back of his mind. He wasn't sure how they would handle everything that came next, but for now he was willing to try. And that, at least, was a start. The sun had barely risen when Neil and Radley arrived at the local farmer's market. A crisp morning breeze carried the scent of fresh produce and baked goods, mingling with the faint chatter of vendors setting up their stalls. The market had always been a lively place, and for a moment it felt like the perfect escape from their strained reality. Neil walked alongside Radley, the two of them moving cautiously through the narrow aisles, dodging carts full of fruits, vegetables, and flowers. It had been his idea to come here, a suggestion that seemed like a good way to keep their newfound connection going after the secretive meeting in the park. But now, surrounded by familiar faces from the neighborhood, the weight of secrecy began to settle on him again. "Do you think anyone will notice us?" Neil asked under his breath, eyes scanning the crowd. He caught a glimpse of a few people he recognized, including Mrs. Jacobs, the woman who had lived next door to them for years. She was standing near a honey stall, blissfully unaware of his presence, but her mere proximity made his heart race. Radley, sensing his discomfort, placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Relax," she whispered, her voice steady. "We're just two people buying groceries. There's nothing wrong with that." But Neil wasn't convinced. Ever since they had started trying to repair their relationship, he had become hyper-aware of how the world saw them. It wasn't that they were doing anything wrong, but the societal judgment surrounding single-parent households and their often misunderstood closeness gnawed at him. He kept his head down, hoping to avoid any unnecessary attention. They stopped at a stall selling homemade bread, Radley carefully choosing a loaf. Neil stood awkwardly beside her, scanning the crowd. That's when he saw her. Mrs. Thompson. She was a friendly woman, their neighbor a few houses down, always quick with a smile or a wave. Normally Neil wouldn't have minded bumping into her, but today wasn't normal. The last thing he needed was a conversation that could spiral into questions about why he and his mother were spending so much time together. His stomach twisted into knots as Mrs. Thompson made her way toward them, her basket swinging casually at her side. "Mom, it's her," Neil hissed, his voice low but urgent. Radley's eyes darted to where he was looking, and she immediately understood. Mrs. Thompson wasn't just any neighbor, she was the kind of person who loved small talk, the type who noticed everything, especially things that were none of her business. Radley's face softened with an understanding smile, but Neil could see the tension in her posture. "We're fine," she said quietly. "Remember, we have nothing to hide." Neil wasn't so sure. He could already imagine the conversations Mrs. Thompson would start with her friends. "I saw Neil and Radley at the market together. They're always together, aren't they? It's unusual." The weight of imagined whispers and gossip pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. "Radley." "Neil, what a surprise." Mrs. Thompson's cheerful voice broke through his thoughts as she approached with a wide smile. "Out shopping together this morning?" Radley turned to her with a warm but guarded smile. "Yes, just picking up a few things for dinner," she replied smoothly, holding up the loaf of bread she had chosen. Mrs. Thompson glanced between the two of them, her smile unwavering but her eyes lingering a bit too long on Neil. "It's so nice to see you both. It's been a while since I've seen the two of you out and about together." Neil felt the heat rise in his cheeks. He didn't know what to say, so he simply nodded, hoping his silence would be enough to end the conversation. But of course, Mrs. Thompson wasn't finished. "You know, it's wonderful that you're spending time together," she said with a slight tilt of her head, as if she were trying to piece together something unsaid. "Not every family manages to stay so close these days, especially after, well, you know?" Her words hung in the air, an unspoken reference to Neil's father's departure, a subject that everyone in the neighborhood seemed to know about but never discussed directly. Neil felt a knot tighten in his chest, his fists clenching slightly at his sides. Radley, ever graceful, handled the situation with ease. Yes, well, we do what we can, she said, her tone light but firm, signaling that there was no need to dig deeper into their personal life. Mrs. Thompson gave a knowing nod, her smile unwavering. That's the spirit. She glanced at her watch, and then back at them. I'd better be off. Lots to do today. But it was so nice to see you both. With that, she waved and continued on her way, disappearing into the crowd as quickly as she had appeared. Neil exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. See? No big deal, Radley said gently, giving his arm a reassuring squeeze. No big deal, Neil echoed incredulously, his voice strained. She's going to tell everyone she saw us here. You know how people talk. Radley sighed, her expression softening with concern. I know it's hard, Neil, but we can't control what people say or think. What matters is that we know the truth, that we're working on this on us. Neil knew she was right, but it didn't make it any easier. He still felt the weight of judgment pressing down on him, the constant need to hide, to explain, to justify. But standing there with Radley, amidst the bustling crowd of the market, he realized something. He was tired of hiding. Tired of pretending. I hate that we have to be so careful all the time, he muttered, his voice barely audible over the noise of the market. Why can't we just be normal? Radley turned to him, her eyes filled with a deep understanding. Because, Neil, sometimes life isn't normal. And that's okay. What we have, it's complicated, but it's ours. And we don't need anyone's approval for that. Neil looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time he saw her not just as his mother, but as someone who had been fighting her own battles for far longer than he had. Someone who, despite everything, was still standing, still trying. And maybe that was enough. As they walked out of the market together, side by side, Neil felt a small shift within himself. He wasn't ready to face the world completely yet, but maybe, just maybe, he was ready to stop hiding from it. The idea of hosting a family gathering had come to Neil almost on a whim. After the tension of the park and the near miss with Mrs. Thompson at the market, he felt the weight of their secrecy more than ever. He was tired of the whispered conversations, the furtive glances, and the constant feeling of needing to explain himself. Maybe it was time for a change, time to show the world that what he and his mother shared wasn't something to hide. I think we should have a party, Neil said suddenly, breaking the silence as he and Radley sat at the kitchen table, sorting through groceries from the market. Radley looked up from the vegetables she was washing, surprise flickering in her eyes. A party? She raised an eyebrow, her voice filled with uncertainty. For what? Neil shifted in his seat, unsure of how to explain it. I think it would be good for us to stop hiding. To show people that we don't have to be embarrassed about being close. We could invite some friends, have dinner, like normal families do. Radley's hands stilled, her expression softening. She could see the determination in Neil's face, but also the anxiety beneath it. He was trying, in his own way, to reclaim something they had lost, to show the world that they were still a family, despite everything. A party. She said thoughtfully, drying her hands with a towel. That's a big step. Neil nodded, his heart racing. I know, but I think it's time. I'm tired of feeling like we have to hide all the time, like we're doing something wrong, just because we're close. Radley studied her son's face, the lines of worry that had settled there in recent months. He had grown up so much since his father had left, carrying burdens that no teenager should have to bear. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the frustration of constantly walking on eggshells around the people in their lives. Okay, she said finally, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Let's do it. We'll have a party. Neil's relief was palpable, his shoulders relaxing as he exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of excitement. This could be the beginning of something new, a way to move forward, to let go of the past and embrace whatever came next. The following weekend, their small home buzzed with energy. The smell of cooking filled the air, mingling with the sound of soft music playing in the background. Radley had spent the morning preparing dishes she knew Neil loved: homemade lasagna, garlic bread, and a chocolate cake for dessert. It was simple but comforting, a reflection of the warmth they were trying to rebuild between them. Neil had invited a few of his closest friends, people who had been there for him through thick and thin. They were the kind of friends who never asked too many questions, who accepted Neil and his situation without judgment. He knew that if anyone could understand what he and Radley were trying to do, it would be them. By early evening, the house was filled with laughter and conversation. Neil's friends Mark, Lisa, and David had arrived with smiles and easy banter, immediately making themselves at home in the cozy living room. Radley greeted them warmly, grateful for their presence. They were good kids, she knew that, and they had been a lifeline for Neil during some of his darkest days. As the evening progressed, Neil found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't expected. His initial nervousness faded as he watched his friends and his mother interact. The laughter that filled the room was genuine, unforced. There were no awkward questions, no side glances or whispers. It was just a group of people enjoying each other's company, sharing food and stories like any other family. At one point, Lisa turned to Radley with a smile. "This lasagna is amazing, Mrs. Radley. You should open a restaurant or something." Radley chuckled, a light blush coloring her cheeks. "Thank you, Lisa. I'll consider it if I ever get tired of working in the office." Mark, who had been silently enjoying his meal, chimed in with a grin. "Seriously, this is the best lasagna I've ever had. I think Neil's been holding out on us." Neil rolled his eyes, but there was a smile on his face. "Yeah, well, I don't want you guys showing up here every weekend for free food." Radley laughed along with them, her heart swelling with warmth. This was what she had been longing for, these simple moments of joy, of connection, without the shadow of judgment looming over them. As the night wore on, the conversation turned deeper. David, who had been quiet for most of the evening, finally spoke up. "You know, Neil, I'm glad you invited us tonight. I know things haven't been easy for you and your mom, but it's nice to see you guys like this. Happy." Neil glanced at Radley, their eyes meeting for a brief moment of shared understanding. He nodded, his voice soft but steady. "Yeah, I guess. I just wanted to stop hiding. I don't want to feel ashamed anymore. We're a family, and that's nothing to be embarrassed about." His friends nodded in agreement, offering quiet words of support. It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of years of secrecy and pain. For the first time in a long while, Neil felt like he could breathe a little easier. Later that night, after their friends had left, and the house had settled into a comfortable quiet, Neil and Radley sat together on the couch, the remnants of the party scattered around them. The dishes could wait until tomorrow. For now, they just wanted to savor the peace. "You did good tonight," Radley said softly, glancing at Neil. "I'm proud of you." Neil shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "It wasn't just me. You were the one who made it happen." Radley shook her head, her expression serious. "No, Neil. This was your idea. You were the one who wanted to stop hiding, to be honest about who we are. That's brave." Neil looked down at his hands, his fingers tracing the edge of a throw pillow. "I'm just tired of pretending. I don't want to do it anymore." Radley reached out, placing her hand gently on his. "You don't have to. We're in this together, remember? No more hiding." Neil nodded, a sense of calm settling over him. For the first time in a long while, he felt like things were going to be okay. Maybe they weren't a traditional family, and maybe they never would be, but they were still a family, and that was all that mattered. As they sat together in the quiet of the night, Neil felt a new sense of hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time he felt ready to face it. No more hiding, no more pretending. Just him, his mother, and the life they were building together. And that, Neil thought, was enough. The soft glow of the sunset cast a golden hue over the small, cluttered living room. The remnants of the evening's party lingered on the coffee table, empty plates, half-drunk glasses of wine, and a few crumpled napkins. Laughter and conversations had filled the space just hours earlier, but now, as the night settled in, there was a comforting stillness. Neil sat on the couch, his legs tucked beneath him, staring out of the window at the darkening sky. Radley sat beside him, leaning back with a quiet sense of peace. The warmth of the gathering still echoed in the room, but there was something deeper in the silence between them now, something unspoken but felt. Neil shifted slightly, glancing at his mother. "I think tonight went well," he said, his voice quiet, almost tentative. Radley nodded, her gaze following his out the window. It did. Your friends are wonderful, Neil. They made it feel normal. She smiled, though there was a hint of wistfulness in her tone. It's been so long since we've had something like that. Neil could hear the weight of her words, the sadness of all the years they had spent apart in one way or another. Even when they had lived under the same roof, the distance between them had grown after his father left. The party tonight had been a small step towards healing, but there was still so much left unspoken between them. I was scared, Neil admitted, running his fingers through his hair, nervous energy coursing through him. I thought that maybe people would judge us, or that we wouldn't be able to pull it off without feeling awkward. Radley turned to him, her eyes filled with warmth and understanding. You don't have to be scared, Neil. We don't owe anyone any explanations. What we have, our bond, it's nobody's business but ours. Neil swallowed hard, his throat tight. But people talk, Mom. They see us spending time together and they assume things. It makes me feel like we're always under a microscope, like we have to prove something. Radley reached out, gently placing her hand on his. Her touch was warm, grounding him in the moment. Neil, listen to me, she said softly, her voice steady but full of emotion. You and I have been through so much. Your father leaving. It tore us apart in ways I never thought possible. But what we've done, what we're doing now, it's about us. About rebuilding what we lost. We don't have to justify that to anyone. Neil's chest tightened, a swirl of emotions rising to the surface. He had spent so many years feeling ashamed, trying to avoid the eyes of the world, trying to avoid the hurt. But his mother was right. The world didn't matter, not when it came to their relationship. I've always been afraid, he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. Afraid that people would think we're too close. That something's wrong with us because we still need each other. Radley's expression softened, and she squeezed his hand gently. There's nothing wrong with needing each other, Neil. You're my son. You'll always be my son. And I'll always be here for you, no matter what the world thinks. Neil's heart pounded, the truth of her words sinking in. He had spent so much of his life hiding, so much of his time worrying about what others thought. But his mother's unwavering love was a constant, a steady force that had never faltered even when things between them had been strained. I don't want to hide anymore, Neil whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. I don't want to keep pretending like we're not important to each other. I want to live our lives without feeling ashamed. Radley smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. Then we will, Neil. We'll live our lives openly, without fear or shame. We've been through too much to let other people's opinions dictate how we live. Neil nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. For the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe freely. The weight of secrecy, of shame, it was lifting, slowly but surely. They sat in silence for a moment, the air between them thick with unspoken understanding. The party had been a turning point, a step towards something new, something better. But there was still more work to be done, more conversations to be had, more healing to embrace. After a long pause, Radley spoke again, her voice soft but firm. Neil, I'm proud of you. For everything. For wanting to fix this. For being brave enough to face the world with me. Neil blinked back the tears that threatened to spill over. I'm proud of you too, Mom. You've always been the strong one, even when I pushed you away. Radley shook her head, a bittersweet smile tugging at her lips. I wasn't always strong, Neil. There were times I didn't know how to reach you. Times I felt like I had failed you. You didn't fail me, Neil said, his voice thick with emotion. You were the one thing that kept me going. Even when I didn't show it. Radley's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. I'm glad you see that now, she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. Neil felt the tears welling in his own eyes, the rawness of the moment almost too much to bear. But it was what they needed, this honesty, this vulnerability. It was the only way they could truly heal. As the tears fell silently, Neil leaned in, wrapping his arms around his mother in a hug that felt both familiar and new. It was a gesture of love, of forgiveness, of understanding. They had been through so much together, but they were still standing, still fighting, still healing. When they finally pulled away, Radley wiped the tears from her cheeks and smiled, her eyes shining with love. We're going to be okay, Neil, she said softly. We're going to get through this. Neil nodded, his heart full. Yeah, he whispered. We will. And in that moment, as they sat together in the quiet of their home, Neil realized that they had already taken the first step towards healing. They didn't need the approval of the world, they only needed each other. And that was enough. It always had been.